G'day guys, welcome back. This is lesson 6, sorry, not 10. Time's moving away from me. So this lesson we're going to look at the role and impact of dissent in Buddhism. Okay, so that's looking at how people differ in sort of opinions and any conflict that can arise from it. Before you start, I want you to do slide 1 and do these 2 revision questions based off last lesson. Alright, and this is your syllabus stop point here if you want to copy that in. So when we're looking at this syllabus stop point, it's a good idea to understand what the word dissent means before we actually explore it. So dissent, if you guys could copy this down as well in your books, it's the expression of opposing opinions with those commonly or officially held. So in other words, it's people disagreeing with each other. So dissent is created particularly in Buddhism around the differences between Theravada and Mahayana. So those two, and even the Tibetan Buddhism as well, those differences in belief. So Theravada being more traditional and conservative, Mahayana, starting with M, being more modern and contemporary, and then the Tibetan Buddhism having a lot more of those spiritual elements to it as well. So there can be dissent among monks and nuns and religious adherents, remembering adherents are followers of those belief practices, between each sort of strand of Buddhism, if you will. So we'll get into more of that in detail, but that's kind of what dissent is. It's people disagreeing with each other based on commonly held beliefs or official beliefs. So with dissent, inevitably there will be conflicting interpretations between what Buddha has taught and what he meant began to appear after his death. So as he was living what he was teaching, everyone could get on board with. But then obviously as years go by and you've got, say, monks and nuns devoting their entire lives to meditating on his scriptures, you're going to have people interpret what he's saying very differently, you know. So after his death, there is a lot of variations and interpretations based around his teachings and what he actually meant. So that's one area of dissent amongst the different strands of Buddhism. This second dot point here is looking at the time of what is known as the Second Council in 383 BC, there was a significant split in the Buddhist movement into the Theravada and Mahayana movements. So that is example there, number 1 of dissent in Buddhism. So it aligns closely with this first dot point here. So upon Buddha's death, when you don't have the guy that created the belief system to guide you, again, as people are meditating and thinking about his teachings, there are going to be different opinions on that. And so that's where that split happened and it occurred. Now I've got some, I'll talk about it in a sec. So the split occurred over matters of practice and doctrine. As we know that Theravada is quite traditional, Mahayana is very a lot more contemporary and modern. But Theravada considered Buddha to be perfectly aligned as a human teacher, whereas Mahayana developed into more of a transcendental view of him. So, in other words, Theravada tended to take Buddha quite literally, if we're going to analyze it that way, whereas Mahayana, developing a more transcendental kind of view of him, used him. Obviously, they still know that and understand that he's an important part of the faith, you know, being the creator of the belief system. But they're looking at more ways they can apply his general principles and core teachings into the life of people all around the world, whereas Theravada tended to take it quite literally. So hence the more asceticism type roots with Theravada, not as attached to worldly possessions and things. So how the split kind of worked is that sort of southern Asia developed more Theravada trends, and Mahayana sort of developed in the northern parts of Asia. So you can see on this map here, China, Korea, Japan, and parts of Tibet, more of the Mahayana influence, whereas Thailand, Burma, that's called Myanmar now, Laos, parts of India are mainly Theravada practice. Again, if you think about asceticism and the roots of that, and Hinduism in India is more aligned with Theravada as well, so it sort of makes a bit more sense to have it there. And again, this is just another map essentially showing you the same thing. This next slide here is looking still again at the role of dissent, but I've got a few other kind of things to talk about it more in depth. So some people believe that Theravada, so this is sort of when we're looking at the impact of dissent now, I suppose. So I might write impact here actually. So still copying all this down. So some people sort of think Theravada were too conservative and literal-minded in their approach to Buddha's message. They believe they're too concerned with individual enlightenment and insufficiently concerned with the needs of lay people. So that's one area of dissent or disagreement among Buddhist practice themselves. We're going to look at some examples a little bit later that will look at that more in depth. But yeah, there's a lot of dissent around Theravada, or criticism, if you will, that they're sort of too focused on themselves. So their version of enlightenment is very individualistic, similar to how Buddha himself gained enlightenment, meditating consistently by himself for a very large number of days and years even. Whereas we know Mahayana are more focused on bodhisattva, which is enlightenment through the helping of others, through that spiritual kind of path. It's a nice segue for this next point. So Mahayana concepts made it possible for bodhisattva, like I was saying, and the idea of continuing revelation beyond the original teachings of Siddhartha. So that idea that you can still become enlightened, but through the helping of others. So again, you can see an interpretation different here. Theravada think the only way to do it is through strict meditation, as Buddha became it. But Mahayana have interpreted that as, well, what did Buddha do after he became enlightened? He helped other people become enlightened, and that's our purpose. So that's sort of the core impact of dissent between those two belief systems you can see there. Or adherence, rather, sorry. What this did in terms of Mahayana is the belief system of the Mahayana strand is more adaptable to the needs and desires of society generally, because it's more flexible. So that suits everyday concerns and behaviours of its society members. So that, again, in the role of dissent, is you would have Theravada believing that a lot of what Mahayana practice does is incorrect. There's also this concept of karma, which is another area of dissent among Buddhists, because karma, like that idea of karma, isn't found in Buddha's original teachings, not literally anyway. It's something that's been interpreted, but it was something that was culturally widespread in a lot of Asian societies in terms of just Eastern philosophy in general. Again, between traditional and contemporary, or traditional and modern, so Theravada and Mahayana, that's a point of contrast, and especially that spiritual element of karma where you are that cycle of death, birth, and rebirthing is very important there. And then lastly, you've got how to reach enlightenment itself, which we touched on here, is also a point of dissent. So do you do it through individual means, or do you do it through the path of bodhisattva, helping other people? What I've got here is just some nice little Buddha quote. Man asked Buddha, I want happiness. Buddha said, remove I, that's ego. Then remove want, that's desire. And now you are only left with happiness. Nice little message there. But again, that's kind of looking at dissent a little bit. You know, people disagree with the world and how they think it operates there, and so they want certain things. And then karma, the principle of karma is do good and good will come to you, aka what goes around comes around, if you're unfamiliar with what that word means. What I want you to do next is I've attached a sheet. Now, I've set this up so I do less printing when I give a class, so you don't need the whole thing, you just need half the page, because that's the exact same thing. What this is looking at is this is a big example of what can happen when dissent happens in Buddhism itself. So we'll give this a read quickly. So essentially in 1963 there was a crisis sort of in Buddhism. So the president of South Vietnam, if we look back here, there's this sort of area, there's a bit of conflicting sort of idea on do we follow Theravada or Mahayana practice, but then you've also got around this time period in the 60s the Vietnam War happening. So you had a lot of influence from the Western world in terms of Catholic religion coming in and influencing. So the president of South Vietnam, we just call him Diem for short, he was a Buddhist by birth but then Catholic by choice. So he ended up leading a government that favoured Catholic citizens and the Catholic Church in almost every way. So for example, anyone who wanted secure government employment, they had to be a practicing Catholic. If the Catholic Church owned a disproportionate amount of land and property, again, they would pay no tax on it. On the other side of the thing, you had every other landowner that wasn't Catholic being heavily taxed to make up for the disparity. So you can see, again, there's already a bit of inequity there. So the inequality reached to such an extent, so it got so bad, that the life and autonomy of Vietnamese, so autonomy means the ability to govern yourself and make decisions for yourself, by yourself. So essentially freedom. It got really bad, particularly for Buddhists, because again, they're not Catholic and that would be seen as a threat to their religion. That was significantly affected. The situation was so disadvantageous to Vietnamese Buddhists that eventually the Buddhist community, now this is a really big deal because Buddhist communities are very peaceful. They got, again, there was dissent. There was so much dissent to the point that the Buddhist community, they were led by monks, reacted with a series of protests that resulted in the mass killing of Buddhist monks by the Catholic and Diem government. Now this image here is really significant. So the dissent got so bad that one Buddhist monk in particular doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire in protest against the unfair treatment of Buddhist people due to the Catholic faith and the president of the country at the time. So that there an example of it in of itself, that dissent between belief systems, between someone that wants to remain a traditional influence in the country, like the Catholic Church, versus a more progressive and modern interpretation of a belief system such as Buddhism. So anyway, eventually the Vietnamese government collapsed. There was a military coup and he died. But essentially, this level of political involvement, particularly from Buddhists, it was praised by some and condemned by others, by both Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike. So Theravada type Buddhists would be typically against this because you should be concerned with individual enlightenment and fixing yourself. What's happening with other people is sort of a secondary concern to you. Whereas the Mahayana Buddhism was seeing this sort of regime as a threat or an impact into the happiness and well-being of everyone else. And it got so bad that they were protesting as well. Now, again, it was peaceful protest, as you can expect. What this is really an example of is the tensions and dissent between those who want a belief system to continue traditionally, like the Catholic Church's belief system was in Vietnam, or those who want to change it to adapt to contemporary society and modern circumstances. So obviously the laws being imposed that favoured Catholics wasn't beneficial for everyone. and it wasn't sort of where the country's context was needed or going. So you can see that idea of dissent there and disagreements is quite potent. Alright, that's it for this lesson.